Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use, tips a balance in favor of fair use. Okay, you guys, so from our one and only wonderful Audit LA, Scientology, where it's a religion and where it absolutely isn't, by Audit LA, dated May 19th, 8:03 p.m. Let's talk Scientology, how the world sees it. Let's talk about who's buying what Scientology is selling and who's not. Some countries have straight up said, nope, this isn't a religion. This is a scam, or a cult, or a really aggressive pyramid scheme with aliens. Others have caved, been tricked, or just didn't care enough to fight back. In the U.S., well, we'll get to that mess in a minute. But before we get into the international breakdown, it's worth asking. How did a religion built on space stories and e-meters end up with tax-exempt status and political influence? A quick reality check on Scientology's origins. A lot of folks already know this, but in case you're new, L. Ron Hubbard was a prolific science fiction writer, maybe the most prolific in U.S. history. However, he wasn't exactly getting wealthy from all of that hard work and creativity. Eventually, he came to the conclusion, if you really want to make money, start a religion. Well, he did just that, hence the Church of Scientology. He converted his science fiction into a belief system, slapped the word church on it, and added some pseudo-scientific tech babble involving ancient alien warlords, hi Xenu, and disembodied souls, thetans, that are stuck to your body causing all your problems. Not joking. It's very sci-fi, very controlling, and very obsessed with paperwork. Kind of like Charlie Igloo Alpha, but what do I know? Confession, auditing, and secrecy, which if you spend 5 minutes looking into cult tactics, should raise some eyebrows. But Scientology insists it's not a cult, because it's got IRS 501c3 status. That's how they argue. They're legit. In a future piece, I'll get into what actually defines a cult and where Scientology lands on that spectrum. Spoiler, it isn't at the healthy community group end, but that's for another day. Let's talk about the U.S. first, because that's where it all really went off the rails. In America, Scientology got its religious recognition the way it gets most things, through intimidation, harassment, and lawsuits. This wasn't some peaceful coexistence with the state. This was Operation Snow White, the largest known infiltration of the U.S. government in history, with Scientologists stealing and shredding federal documents, not destroying evidence, from inside government buildings. You think I'm exaggerating? Google it. It's all there. Then came the war with the IRS. Scientology filed over 2,000 lawsuits and sent private investigators after IRS officials. Eventually, the IRS just gave up. In 1993, they cut a secret deal, ones that never really been released to the public, and handed over tax-exempt status. So when people say, but it's recognized as a religion in the U.S., my response is yeah, because the government got bullied into it, not because it really is. Now let's zoom out. What countries recognize Scientology and which ones said no? Scientology doesn't have the resources to influence every country's government like they did here. So it's fascinating to see who resisted, who folded, and how hard they had to work for it. Countries that said, yes, you're a religion for now. These countries either gave Scientology religious status through courts, procedural process, or because they got broad laws protecting all belief systems, even the wild ones. United States. The U.S. is where Scientology won its biggest prize, religious tax exemption in 1993. But it didn't happen through faith or public acceptance. It happened after a relentless legal sleep. The church filed over 2,000 lawsuits against the IRS, stalked employees, and used its usual cocktail of pressure, PR, and private investigators until the government gave in. I personally don't believe that story, but no shade to Audit LA. She's just writing her story. The details of the backroom deal still sealed. So yes, Scientology is recognized as a religion in the U.S., but only after exhausting, intimidating, and outmaneuvering the agency tasked with saying no. It wasn't a moral win, it was a strategic one. And ever since, that recognition has been used as a shield, not a sign of legitimacy. Australia. It's a cult, mate. In Australia, Scientology got its religious status the old-fashioned way, through a long legal fight that ended with the courts basically saying, well, sure, I guess it's a religion by legal standards. In 1983, the High Court ruled in the famous Church of the New Faith versus Commissioner of Payroll tax case that Scientology met the broad legal test for religion, mainly because it had a belief system and a moral code, even if it sounded totally bizarre. That ruling didn't mean the public was on board. In fact, Australia has done some of the most damning investigations into Scientology anywhere in the world. Journalists, senators, and ex-members have been calling them out for years. So yeah, they're legally recognized, but don't mistake that for public acceptance. That fight's still very much alive, and you better believe I'll be digging deeper into what they pulled down under. South Africa. In South Africa, Scientology got recognized as a religion mostly because the laws there are super broad when it comes to religious freedom, which on principle is a good thing, but Scientology definitely took advantage of that open door. They showed up with the usual playbook, humanitarian campaigns. That's an inversion. Free booklets, fake awards, ceremonies, and lots of photo ops with government officials. Cha-ching! They took advantage of the post-apartheid language of rights and dignity, which is especially offensive when you consider how they treat their own members. They even handed out human rights awards to local politicians. Classic safe pointing. So yeah, they got the recognition, but it wasn't because anyone looked too hard. It was PR, not public demand. In Sweden, Scientology got religious recognition through a pretty straightforward registration process. They filled out the paperwork, said the right buzzwords, and were allowed in. That doesn't mean Sweden rolled out the red carpet. It just means the bar for registering a religion there isn't super high. It's more like, you say you're a religion? Fine, you're a religion. But that doesn't come with government funding or public trust. In fact, Swedish media and watchdogs have kept a close eye on them, especially around their aggressive recruiting tactics and how they treat critics. So yeah, they're on the books, but nobody's confusing them with a national treasure. Spain. Scientology clawed its way into religious recognition in Spain the same way it has elsewhere, through legal loopholes and relentless litigation. After years of being rightly labeled a sect, the Spanish Supreme Court caved in 2007, granting them official religious status. But let's be clear, this wasn't because the Spanish people suddenly saw Scientology as holy. It was because the church outlawyered the system. They appealed, pressured, and pushed until they got the title, not because they earned trust, but because the court saw no clear legal reason to say no. To this day, public sentiment hasn't changed. Spain may recognize Scientology on paper, but the people still know a cult when they see one. Portugal. Scientology managed to register as a religious organization in Portugal, but only because no one was really paying attention. It wasn't some grand public debate or spiritual awakening. It was a quiet, bureaucratic filing, likely rubber stamped by a government office that treats religion as a checkbox, not a credibility test. But recognition doesn't equal relevance. In the public sphere, Scientology is practically invincible in Portugal. No cultural footprint, no mass recruitment, no real public presence, just a paper trail that says religion and a tax break riding on the back of silence. It's legal, sure, but it's also largely unwanted. Brazil. Scientology is legally registered as a religion in Brazil, but don't let that fool you into thinking it holds real ground. Recognition here is easy to get. It's a low bar, high paperwork system, and Scientology checked the boxes. But in terms of influence, almost non-existent. The group has tried to set up ideal orgs and run its usual front groups, but the Brazilian public isn't flocking to pay for auditing or climb a bridge. In a country with a rich religious history, from Catholicism to Afro-Brazilian religions, Scientology looks more like a foreign business venture than a faith. They may have the paperwork, but they don't have the people. Hungary. Hungary once allowed Scientology to operate with religious status, until the government finally said enough. In 2011, a sweeping overhaul of the country's religion laws revoked official recognition from dozens of fringe groups. And yes, Scientology made that cut. Today it's treated as a church-like organization, without the constitutional protections or tax perks granted to legitimate religions. Authorities have raided its headquarters, citing data privacy violations. Imagine that. And health code breaches. Translation: even a government accused of authoritarian leanings knows Scientology's game, and they're not buying the sacred routine. In Hungary, the facade cracked, and what's underneath looks a lot more like a corporate racket than a church. Netherlands. The Netherlands gave Scientology religious status decades ago, but even though their own courts saw through the scam. In 2013, a Dutch court ruled that while Scientology may call itself a religion, its actual operations are purely commercial. In other words, they might preach about thetans, but they bill like a tech startup. The court stripped them of their tax-exempt status, saying their religious services were indistinguishable from high-priced self-help sessions. So yes, they can claim to be a religion, but the Dutch legal system made it crystal clear. If you act like a business, sell like a business, and exploit people like a business, then you don't get the perks of a church, period. New Zealand. Scientology pulled off official recognition in New Zealand in the early 2000s, managing to register as a charitable religious organization. But don't confuse paperwork with public trust. This wasn't a cultural embrace. It was a bureaucratic technicality in a country with a broad legal definition of religion. The New Zealand Charities Commission has faced pressures for years to scrutinize groups like Scientology that use religion as a shield for commercial gain and psychological manipulation. The church may get tax breaks and the ability to perform weddings, but in the public eye, it's still fringe. In a land that values transparency and decency, Scientology's playbook of secrecy and coercion sticks out like a sore thumb. United Kingdom. In the UK, Scientology fought for decades to be recognized as a religion, and in 2013, they finally got the legal win they craved. The UK Supreme Court ruled that Scientology chapels could be used for legally binding marriages, effectively, granting it religious status under the law. But let's be honest, this was a technical victory, not a moral one. The ruling didn't endorse Scientology's beliefs. It just said they met the broad legal test for what counts as worship. Meanwhile, the British public has remained firmly skeptical, and government agencies have long refused to work with or promote the organization. Scientology may have cracked the legal code in England, but on the streets, in Parliament, and in the press, it's still seen as a cult in a fancy hat. Taiwan. In Taiwan, Scientology managed to get recognized as a religion, but not because people were lining up to hear about Xenu. Like in a lot of places, they got in the door by wrapping themselves in human rights and community service, mostly through their front groups like the Way to Happiness and Youth for Human Rights. They love to hand out booklets and stage ribbon cuttings, and some local officials fell for the PR. Cha-ching! Taiwan has pretty relaxed religious laws. It wasn't a big legal battle like in the U.S. It was more like a slow, well-rehearsed charm offensive. But just because they got the paperwork doesn't mean the public's buying what they're selling. Denmark. Denmark stands out as one of the few European countries to give Scientology full religious recognition and keep it. Since the 1970s, the Danish government has allowed Scientology to register as an official religion, granting it tax exemptions and legal protections. But don't mistake that for public approval. Denmark's decision was based on liberal religious freedom laws, not a belief that Scientology was morally upright or socially beneficial. The group's Copenhagen headquarters, one of its main European hubs, has long operated in plain sight, even as former members and watchdogs ring alarm bells about abuse, disconnection, and financial exploitation. Denmark may have welcomed them legally, but culturally, they remain a well-dressed warning sign. Mexico. In Mexico, Scientology didn't win hearts. It slipped through unnoticed. The government granted it religious status in 2009 through a simple registration with the Secretariat of the Interior, with no public hearings, no scrutiny, no real questions asked. Cha-ching! This wasn't an endorsement. It was a rubber stamp in a country where religious registration is often just a formality. Since then, Scientology has tried to cozy up to officials through front groups pushing human rights education and anti-drug campaigns. But the public isn't fooled. On the ground, it has almost no real following and even less trust. It may be recognized on paper, but it's treated like an outsider that bought a fake badge. Countries that said, no way. Germany, France, and Russia. These are the places that looked at Scientology and said, you are not a religion, you are a cult, a fraud, or a threat. Germany. Germany has made its position crystal clear. Scientology is not a religion. It's a danger to democracy. The government classifies it as a commercial organization with anti-constitutional goals, and it's been under official surveillance by domestic intelligence agencies for decades. Germany doesn't mince words. They've called out Scientology for its totalitarian structure, psychological manipulation, and aggressive tactics. Politicians, educators, and civilian groups have publicly warned citizens to steer clear. This isn't just skepticism, it's systemic resistance. In a country with historical scars from authoritarian cults of personality, Germany knows what control looks like, and they're not giving Scientology an inch. France. France doesn't just reject Scientology, they prosecuted it. The French government classifies Scientology as a sect, a cult, and they back that up with criminal convictions. In 2009, the Paris branch of the Church of Scientology was found guilty of organized fraud, and French parliamentary commissions have repeatedly listed it as a threat to public order and mental health. The group is allowed to operate, but under constant scrutiny and zero religious recognition. France takes its commitment to secularism seriously, and that means no free passes for corporate cults hiding behind the word church. Scientology is tolerated legally, but socially and politically, it's radioactive. China. China doesn't recognize Scientology as a religion. It labels it as a dangerous cult, and that's not up for debate. The government has outlawed its literature, shut down its operations, and made it crystal clear this isn't a church. It's a threat. Beijing doesn't tolerate foreign movements that manipulate people, hoard money, and preach secrecy, especially ones trying to slide in under the radar with fake humanitarian front groups. Try running a stress test booth in Shanghai. You will get shut down and maybe more. China saw the playbook and slammed the door before the ink dried. In one of the most surveillance-heavy countries on earth, Scientology doesn't stand a chance, and they know it. Russia. Russia doesn't just reject Scientology. It treats it like a national security threat. The government has banned multiple Scientology organizations, outlawed its literature as extremist, and even shut down the Moscow Church of Scientology by court order. Officials have accused the group of undermining public order, operating illegally as a business, and acting as a foreign-controlled influence operation. Members have been arrested, offices raided, and bank accounts frozen. In Russia, Scientology isn't seen as a church. It's seen as a toxic import with authoritarian tendencies. And the state has responded with equally authoritarian rejection. Whatever else you might say about Russia, when it comes to Scientology, they saw the red flags and slammed the door. Ireland. Ireland has never granted Scientology religious status, and they're not about to start. While the group has opened flashy ideal orgs and tried to charm local communities with concerts, anti-drug initiatives, the Irish government has remained unmoved. I love the Irish. I got Irish in me, right? Scientology is not recognized as a religion, does not qualify for charitable tax exemptions, and receives zero legal perks. It exists there as a private organization, nothing more. And the public? They see right through it. Investigative journalism and grassroots resistance have kept Scientology's footprint small and its reputation radioactive. In a country with deep scars from real religious abuse, there's no appetite for cult theatrics, dressed up as salvation. Belgium. Belgium has been calling Scientology what it is for decades, a dangerous manipulative cult. It is not recognized as a religion, and for years the Belgian government treated it like a criminal enterprise. After a 10-year investigation, prosecutors brought sweeping charges against the church and 12 of its leaders in 2015. Fraud, extortion, illegal medical practice, and running a criminal organization. While a judge ultimately acquitted them on procedural grounds, the message from the state couldn't have been clearer. Scientology doesn't belong in the same category as churches, mosques, or synagogues. It operates in Belgium, yes, but under suspicion, not sanctity. And the public? They've never bought the church act. Greece. We voted you off the island. Greece didn't just reject Scientology, they shut it down. In 1997, the Greek Supreme Court stripped the Church of Scientology of its legal status, calling it out for a profit business masquerading as a religion. The group was ordered to dissolve after the court found it operated deceptively and harmfully. targeting vulnerable individuals while hiding behind a religious front. Since then, any attempt to relaunch under a new name or as a front group has been met with skepticism and resistance. Greece sent a clear message: freedom of religion doesn't mean freedom to exploit. And unlike some governments, they didn't flinch when it came time to act. Austria. Austria doesn't recognize Scientology as a religion, and they're not shy about it. The government officially classifies it as a sect, not a church. And it's been the subject of repeated warnings from Austrian ministries and watchdog groups. While Scientology is allowed to operate, it receives no tax exemptions, no legal religious status, and no public legitimacy. Officials have raised concerns over coercive tactics, financial exploitation, and psychological harm, especially toward young recruits, children. Austria treats Scientology the way a healthy democracy should, as a high-control organization posing as a faith, not something that deserves the legal perks of actual religions. Israel. In Israel, Scientology is managed to set up shop, but that's about where the success story ends. While it's not banned, it's also not recognized as a religion by the state, and it gets none of the legal benefits that come with that status. The organization operates under a standard nonprofit umbrella, but even that has drawn scrutiny. Their flashy ideal org in Tel Aviv hasn't translated into public support, and mainstream Israeli society largely views Scientology as a Western import with cult-like tendencies, not a legitimate faith. In a country deeply familiar with both spirituality and manipulation, Scientology reads more like a foreign scam than a sacred path. Canada, federally. Canada has never recognized Scientology as a religion at the federal level, and for good reason. The group has been dragged through Canadian courts for decades, most notably in the landmark Hill versus Church of Scientology case, where the church was found liable for defamation and abuse of process. In Ontario, the courts have flat out stated that Scientology is not a religion, but a commercial venture, operating under the guise of spiritual counseling. While it's technically allowed to operate as a nonprofit, in some provinces, that status comes with no religious credibility, no tax exemption, and no public trust. In the eyes of Canadian law and society, Scientology is a business, and a shady one at that. Armenia. In Armenia, Scientology doesn't even make it past the door. The country is deeply tied to the Armenian Apostolic Church, and the government keeps a tight grip on who gets to call themselves a religion. Scientology isn't on the list and never will be. It's not recognized, it's not protected, and it's not welcome. The group's cult tactics, money games, and foreign backing are exactly the kind of thing Armenians see as a threat, not a faith. Sure, they might sneak in with a workshop here or a seminar there, but officially and culturally, they're nowhere. Armenia knows a real church when it sees one, and Scientology isn't it. Japan. In Japan, Scientology exists, but only barely, and with no official religious recognition. The group maintains a tiny footprint, mostly through low-profile offices and personality development seminars. But it has no legal status as a religious organization, no cultural relevance, and no public trust. Japanese society is still haunted by the legacy of actual destructive cults like Shinryo, tends to view outfits like Scientology with deep suspicion. The government hasn't had to ban it because no one's buying what it's selling. In a country that values humility and social harmony, Scientology's blend of arrogance, secrecy, and hard sell tactics just doesn't land. Egypt. In Egypt, Scientology doesn't stand a chance. The government does not recognize it as a religion, and any attempt to operate openly would be met with swift state suppression. Egypt recognizes only a handful of religions, primarily Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and treats all others with suspicion or outright hostility. Scientology's secretive structure, Western origins, and cult-like reputation make it a non-starter. There's no legal pathway for recognition, no public presence, and no cultural tolerance for what would be seen as a manipulative foreign ideology. In Egypt, Scientology isn't just unrecognized, it's outright rejected. India. India doesn't recognize Scientology as a religion, and frankly, nobody's asking for it. In a country home to some of the world's oldest spiritual traditions, Scientology reads more like a Western export, with a price tag than anything sacred. It's not legally registered as a religious body, and it holds zero cultural weight. The group's attempts to wedge in through volunteer ministries and self-help seminars haven't fooled anyone. There's no movement, no legitimacy, and no demand. India already knows what real devotion looks like, and Scientology's glossy hustle doesn't even register as noise. So what does this all mean? It means that religious recognition doesn't equal legitimacy. In the U.S., we're expected to treat Scientology with reverence because they won a 501c3 fight by harassing public servants until they folded. I thought that was against the law as well, but you know. And now if you criticize Scientology, they went to call it a hate crime. Come on. Yeah, said from Scientology that labels gay people as two on the tone scale, and disabled children 2 on the tone scale. 2 or a 1. I don't think it's hateful to call out corruption, abuse, and deception, and I don't think the rest of the world is wrong for refusing to play along. The truth is some governments did their homework and others got steamrolled. What's next? This was just a quick flyover. Plan to go deeper, especially into Australia, the Operation Snow White files, and the cult designation debate. And if you want me to dig into what's going on in your country or state, let me know. This stuff needs sunlight, because Scientology didn't get here on spiritual merit. It got here by force, fraud, and legal loopholes, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. All right, so I will leave a link in the description box. Like and subscribe if you choose. Otherwise, have an amazing day or night wherever you are. Peace.